Hello everybody, it's time for the answers for Daily Dictation 256. Now this story was talking about a robot, a human-looking robot, and we call that type of a robot an android, A-N-D-R-O-I-D, androids. I don't know, androids are a little bit scary, if you ask me. I don't want to meet an android on the street. No thanks, no thanks. So, did you do the dictation? It was a bit tricky. If you didn't, here's another chance to listen.
They've also made it super buff for when it decides to turn on its human masters.
They've also made it super buff for when it decides to turn on its human masters. Yeah, well, the red lines were the most difficult areas. Buff is the most difficult word. Buff is probably a new word for many of you. I'll explain. Let's go back to the beginning. They have, they've also. Now we keep the V sound and we connect. They've also, keep that V. They've also made it. Now, we got a D connection here. Remember, whenever we have a word that begins with a vowel, that's it? Oh, here we go. In this situation, we're almost always going to have a connection, okay? Almost always. Natural connection. So in this case, made it, no, made it. So, perfect pronunciation, made it super. Made it super. But when we say it fast, made it super. Made it super. Made it super. So the D connects, and here we have what we call a stop sound. So we go to the T, it, but don't finish the T. Stop. When your tongue hits the roof of your mouth, made it right on that ridge, the alveolar ridge. Made it stop. Made it super. And from that position, make the S sound. Made it super. So it's a stop T and then a strong S. They've also made it super buff. They've also made it super buff. Some people want to say super, but 98.3% of Americans say super. Super buff. Super buff. Super buff. No, so once again, this is probably a new word. They've also made it super buff for when it... Alright, so the next word is for. And I also want you to remember, if you see OR in America, usually it sounds more like ER. So for, most Americans will actually say fur when we say it normally. Okay? Super buff for when, super buff for when. So these F's all go together. It's kind of tough. Super buff for when, super buff for when, for when, for when. Get that W, and then the N connects. When it decides. For when it decides. For when it decides. Now, lots of people miss the word it. If there's no it, for when decides. For when decides. For when decides. No, not going to work. For when it decides. For when it decides. For when it decides. Yeah? So remember, after a when relative pronoun, you should have a subject for when it decides. So, why is this difficult? Because we have similar sounds next to each other. T, d. Very similar sounds. And almost always, when you have similar sounds, we connect and just keep the second word. Especially for non-context words. Those sounds really disappear. Here, super buff for when, super buff for when. The F is actually very long, okay? This is an important word. It's a context word, so the pronunciation is clear, but this is not that important, so it's much more difficult to hear. when it decides. Now, look at the word decides. So we talk about this in DDM. Decides, remember, pretend, elect. This E prefix, re, d, b, e, that prefix, usually it sounds like an I or an okay? So this decides is perfect, but most Americans are going to say decides or decides or decides, okay? It's going to be a schwa sound, okay? And how do you do the schwa? There we go. So decides, decides. D, 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 d. Decides, decides. Decides, decides. For when it decides, for when it decides, for when it decides, it's right in the middle of this I and sound. Very relaxed sound. It's a schwa. For when it decides to, so also be careful here, the D and the S, this is actually a Z sound. When these sounds are next to each other, it's very tough. However, I'll give you this word and this word. Sides, size. Sides, sides. This is like that. And these two are different, okay? So the bottom one is just smooth the whole time. Size, size, sides. When we do this, the D, the tongue goes to the top and hits the D like a stop T, a stop D, and from that stop D position, we do Z, sides, sides. So your tongue touches and goes to the Z. Here, there's no touching. Size, size, sides, sides. Very difficult, but it's a sound you need to get. Okay, so keep practicing. For when it decides to turn. For when it decides to turn. So this is the to word. To actually has 7 pronunciations. Ta, da, ta, da, t, d, and to. And t and d are the most common. Okay? Any of them are possible. However, t and d are most common. In this case, for when it decides to turn. For when it decides to turn. Decides to turn. It's going to be a t. Most Americans will probably use a t sound. To turn. This is an ER sound, T-E-R-N, turn. To turn on, so once again we have a connection, turn on it. Here too, we have a stop T, but a strong S. Turn on it, turn on it, turn on it, human. Now, some people will say it's human, with no H. But most Americans will keep the H. It's human. Get that H. It's really tough. It's human masters. To turn on its human masters. To turn on its human masters. So let's say it 2 times. 1 time, slow. The next time, normal. Okay, let's say it. Ready? 1, 2, 3. They've also made it super buff for when it decides to turn on its human masters. 1 more time, slowly. 1, 2, 3. They've also made it super buff for when it decides to turn on its human masters. Okay? Now let's say it normal. 1, 2, 3. They've also made it super buff for when it decides to turn on its human masters. Listen to the intonation, the rhythm, the flow, the peaks. They've also made it super buff for when it decides to turn on its human masters. Okay? Alright, let's say it 1 more time and then listen to the original. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. They've also made it super buff for when it decides to turn on its human masters.
They've also made it super buff for when it decides to turn on its human masters. They've also made it super buff for when it decides to turn on its human masters.
I hope that you can hear all of the words. Now, they, who is they? They refers to NASA, I'll write it down here, NASA, and General Motors, the car company. So these two, NASA and GM, they created this robot. They've also made it. It refers to the robot. The robot's name is R2. They've also made R2, the robot, super buff. Buff means very muscular. Very muscular. Like, well, not like me. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger or some boxer, something like that. Super buff. So not just buff, super buff. So if somebody is super buff, they're probably super strong, right? Yes. So NASA and GM have also made the robot super buff. Why? For this situation. What situation? For when the robot R2, for when R2 decides to do something. I'm going to do something. What is the robot going to decide to do? To turn. To turn? No. To turn on its human masters. We can say to turn on someone or to turn against someone. To turn on someone, to turn against someone means to betray them. So for a time, you're friends, you work together, and then one day you say, "You are my enemy," and you kill them. Well, that's the idea here. So really, NASA and GM are preparing for robots to turn on us, the human masters? No, that's a nightmare. It might happen. It might happen one day. If scientists keep creating robots with super strength and super intelligence, one day the robots might turn on us, the humans, the masters. And then if the robots turn on us and they're stronger than us and smarter than us, then we become the slaves. And the movie, The Matrix, becomes reality. Sounds pretty scary. Yeah. You know, robots, the idea of robotics, using machines to help humans live better lives, more comfortable lives, to do dangerous jobs, to go to dangerous places, to do difficult tasks. That's a great idea. But I'm worried. What if this actually comes true? What do you think? Leave a message down below. And our new DD exercise, daily dictation exercise, is ready. We studied this entire article in DDM. If you have not joined DDM, join today. You can get 8 free lessons if you go to www.letsmasterenglish.com/tryddm. Leave your name and your email address, and we will email the lessons to you. 8 lessons. That's a month of DDM. We study DDM 2 lessons a week. That's 1 month of lessons. DDM requires 30 minutes a day. 30 minutes, 6 days a week. 1 day vacation. So if you want to master English, speaking, listening, pronunciation, American culture, join DDM. Get the free lessons today. I'm out of here. Good luck on the next daily dictation lesson. Yeah.